Welcome to our webinar about SharePoint document management. We're going to cover today how the document lifecycle can be supported in SharePoint and what are some of the key considerations. So without further ado, I'm joined by my colleague, Ben. Ben, who is this for and what are people going to take away from today?
Yeah, thanks, Rupert. So this is for anyone that is planning a move to SharePoint. If you're thinking of moving from a file share and want to start using SharePoint, or perhaps if you're already using SharePoint and you want to get more out of it as an effective document management system. In terms of takeaways, the first thing you're going to be looking at is how to define the right structure and the importance of defining a structure to ensure that your information has the right usability. We'll then look at how you can get confidence through consistency in terms of how you create and collaborate. And then finally, we'll be thinking about the trusted source of the truth, the importance of not having lots of duplication of content and people know where things are.
Okay, I mean, and that's a key when everyone starts on their SharePoint journey is, I want that trusted source of the truth. But before we do that, I thought it might be worth covering how we typically see the SharePoint journey evolving for many organizations, which is SharePoint used to be complicated. You used to build servers and things like that. But when Microsoft 365 came along, it became part of a package. So most people think it can't be that hard. Let's just turn it on and see how we go. They then created maybe some sites in SharePoint with document libraries. So that's the area where you store files. They might also create some teams and some collaboration areas in teams. And then everyone in the organization will also have a OneDrive. But that creates confusion because people don't understand, well, where do I start saving my files? And everyone does their best, but everyone's working slightly differently. When you start working differently, then you'll find that search isn't returning the results you're looking for. And people come to us and say, search isn't working for us. It's all in there somewhere, but we're not finding it. And then people get frustrated because they can't find the data they're looking for. Because of that, then you start losing confidence in the information that you do find. And what that means is that generally people will go back to the author or the owner of that content, make a Teams call or whatever it might be, or wander over to their desk and say, where is this document? Or I found this document. Is it the right version? And people lost confidence in the information. And we're losing, the great thing about SharePoint is when done well, we can work autonomously because we can find the information that we're looking for. And we have confidence that when we find it, it's the information is correct. And ultimately, where does this get us to? Well, no one likes SharePoint. It's pretty punchy, but it's true. And it's not SharePoint they don't like. They don't like how it's been configured. They don't like how the training's happened because it may have not been consistent. And that's where that frustration comes and people trying to find different ways to solve it. So Ben, given all that, where do we start if we're looking at our SharePoint journey?
So yeah, what we're going to start looking at is this concept of the document lifecycle. We'll take that from end to end. So we start with creation. So we're talking about making sure that we're creating documents using the right template at the right time and saving them to the right place. We'll then be having a look at the collaboration journey. So I want to share with my colleagues. I want to work on documents together and I want to avoid having lots of duplicate copies of these things. Once we've gone through and collaborated on our document, it will need some form of review and approval. Maybe it's a contract that needs to be reviewed. Perhaps it's a policy that needs someone else's input. We've gone through, we've approved our documents. Now we need to think about how we're going to make them available to people. Do we need to publish them for others to access? Do we need to file them for a compliance reason or to refer back to at some point in the future? And so we need to consider how we're going to do that and make it searchable so we can get that information when we need it. And then finally, we need to be considering what our compliance obligations are. So typically people will say, I need to keep certain types of documents for 7 years, but what happens at the end of it? Maybe you're relying on backups to do that. And actually, are you going through and ensuring that the correct content is being removed or disposed of at the right point in time?
Okay. And then that's how the document flows through, but there's got to be some glue which holds it all together.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first point really is around this concept of an information architecture. So as a client said to me recently, they see this as being a place for everything and everything in its place, which I think sums it up really nicely.
Yeah. And when you come onto that second piece where you're saying everything in its place, that really comes down to adoption or training. So how do we make sure everyone in the organization is working the same way? And I think this is a key part of, we're trying to take away the energy of let's put the energy into creating the content rather than thinking, where do I save this? And let's make that as easy as possible. And then the final thing is evolution. And I think we see evolution in a number of ways. The first being that maybe the answer you come to today will change in a year's time for, a number of reasons. One of those might be that you have different regulatory requirements. Maybe you have to protect information in a different way, or maybe even destroy it. The second being your organization requirements will change, and therefore you might need to look at how we restructure or add parts onto your SharePoint information architecture. And the final point, and really prevalent right now, is the change in technology. So you're probably hearing a lot about AI. There's Microsoft Syntax. That is going to help you actually classify and identify information in documents automatically without people having to go through manually. So there's lots of things changing. And so even when you go live with SharePoint, you need to consider, what does this look like going forward? Because if you find that your SharePoint environment doesn't keep up with your organization's requirements, people are going to find different ways to do things, and you're going to start losing the integrity of your SharePoint solution. So Ben, information architecture, I think it's probably worth just diving into that. It sounds quite a complicated term.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as we kind of set on this statement here, it's about, I don't really want to have to think too hard about where things need to go. It just needs to be quite clearly laid out and presented to me. So let's just move on to the next slide a second. So the kind of three key facets of information architecture are people, content, and access. And we put people at the top because it is really the most important. What are the different types of people or user personas that are going to be involved in your information? Who needs to be creating stuff? Who needs to be consuming or accessing stuff? And then what type of content are they creating or consuming? Is it media files? Is it things like policies? Is it contracts, et cetera, et cetera? Is it sales collateral? And then finally, what type of access should they have? So for something like the sales collateral scenario, it may be that salespeople need to quickly have access to that quite readily. But for something like employee records, that needs to be much more restricted. So when we think of access, we're thinking both permissions and security, but we're also thinking about targeting things to the right people. So they're seeing what's relevant to them and not actually seeing all this other information that's not as useful. And then to the side of that, we need to be thinking about the context. So as we say here, are we thinking of collaboration, as we talked about in the previous slides? Are we thinking about publishing or filing? And what we're really highlighting here is, and again, sorry, underpinned by governance, but what we're highlighting is where I collaborate on something may not be the same as where I publish it. I might collaborate in a workspace somewhere and then I'll publish it to the intranet. Or I might collaborate in a HR area as I'm working on something and I'll go file an employee record into an appropriate repository that's got the right retention settings on it.
Okay, so that collaboration piece might be, we create the contract when it's, DocuSigned or whatever signature tool of choice you might use. You can then put in a filing area, which is, will have different requirements and may, as you say, you talk about that governance piece, well, we want to protect a signed contract from accidental deletion, for example. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, Ben, is it worth just bringing up SharePoint at this point and just seeing how this starts to come together?
Yeah, I think so. Let's go and pop into our demo environment. So what we're looking at here is an intranet homepage. And the reason and rationale for that is it's effectively our entry point into our SharePoint system. We've got our news, we've got our links to our common tools, but actually what we're interested in today is the navigation pane that we see at the top of the screen. So if you hover over the intranet hub, what we're seeing on the left here, all of these settings that appear, all these navigation options that appear here are very much that published content. That's the information that has been published for everyone else in the organization to access. So it's things like document templates, information about IT that we need to go and access, information about people and ourselves as an organization. As we move along the navigation, we have our policies area, and then we'll go into things like knowledge, and then into more document management specific scenarios such as clients. And then finally, we come over to the departments area, and what we can see is the different workspaces for those different people. So let's say if I'm in HR, I might have my department workspace where I'll go and work on employee files or cases that I've got to deal with. But I'll be publishing a lot of content over into the people section on the intranet because that is information that other people need to go and access. And actually, as a rule of thumb, what we tend to do is when we organize our navigation in the top there, everything on the left is focused on things that are available to everyone. And as we move over to the right, it narrows down and becomes a bit more specific. So as I say, everything on the right-hand side is much more about the individual and the workspace where they are going to be collaborating and doing work. So I think a couple of other points. Now, what we do just want to draw attention to. So modern SharePoint has actually now been around for quite a while. So it's not perhaps quite as modern as it was, but obviously what we're looking at here is a much more user-friendly SharePoint environment than perhaps something you may have been used to historically. And a couple of key things about this that I just want to highlight, actually, if you just resize the screen a minute, Rupert, we'll see, of course, that natively this is responsive. So, it's going to work natively on a mobile device, just as it would if you're accessing on your desktop. So it will go and resize itself. And in fact, there are things like the SharePoint mobile app available, so you can get access to this content more easily. And then the final thing, again, if we just hover over the navigation one more time, what we're seeing here is, historically with SharePoint, we might organize it into a sort of hierarchy of subsites. We're not really doing that anymore. We're just creating different pockets of information, and we have tied them together via something called a hub, which gives us that consistent navigation experience as we move through our SharePoint estate.
Okay.
So should we just, do a quick summary?
Okay. So Ben, the key takeaways, I think you started out right in the middle, which was map out your content. And I think some of the bits you touched on there was certainly around separating where you create and where you publish. I think a lot of scenarios we see where, should we say, self-implementers, they put in the HR folder and everything regarding policies and the public information, should we say, within the organization, and the private information gets a bit mixed up, and that can cause security issues, which obviously leads on to the piece on the right around permissions and creating your sites to reflect those permissions. One of the things that you talk about, certainly when those workshops, is not getting too granular with permissions, because that's going to cause a management overhead. And then the last piece is supporting all this information through the roles of your people. So I think a couple of key takeaways at the bottom there as well is, let's not confuse the publishing with creation and filing, and that's why we tend to separate those things. And navigation doesn't need to be an exact replica of all the sites that you have, and maybe the document libraries or the file storage areas within those, but think about actually what do people need to access. So in that example, we had a mixture of sites, libraries, and actual individual pages. So Ben, we've created our information architecture. We've created some areas to store information. Where do we start?
So we're going to look at that document lifecycle. So we're going to go and create a document from scratch. And actually, where we're going to start now, instead of going into SharePoint, we're actually going to fire up Microsoft Word, because that effectively is typically where we're going to go if I want to create a brand new document. So we've got Word open. We're going to go new. Click on the new button there, please, Rupert, if that's okay. Good stuff. So what we can see under this, where it says Contoso, so effectively, Contoso is the fictitious organization that we're demonstrating from. So effectively, what we have done is publish a standard set of templates, which are stored within SharePoint, but they have been published so they come straight through into Microsoft Word. So in your case, that might, instead of saying Contoso, that would have your organization name, and you'd be able to go and see all of the standard templates that have been managed and published to everyone. So what we're going to do is open up this explore phase contract, please.
And Ben, when you say publish, does that mean that A, everyone's going to have those same documents across every user in my organization? And B, if I update them in SharePoint, do I need to do something manually, or are they just going to update automatically?
Yeah, exactly. So if you update them in SharePoint, they'll come through and they'll be updated automatically for yourself. It is possible to create different sets of templates that would be targeted to different users. So again, you could secure those templates in SharePoint, and only people perhaps in HR might be able to access the HR templates, for example. Okay,
that would make sense.
Now, so a common complaint that we have when people talk about templates historically is this common scenario where they go and publish a template, but then people accidentally go and save over the template instead of actually saving as a new document. But with this mechanism, that's not going to happen, because we can see at the top there, it says document 1, it recognizes this is a brand new document that I need to save somewhere, as opposed to being able to accidentally overwrite the existing template that I have. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go and save it. So Rupert, if you wouldn't mind clicking on the File tab, we're going to go Save As. And the reason for doing that, we want to be aware of what our different locations are that we can save to. Now, because Microsoft Word is directly connected with SharePoint nowadays, I can save straight into my SharePoint libraries without having to go and open a browser and upload. So Rupert's clicked on Sites. We're going to go into our clients area because this is a contract. So we've got a few different libraries here, a few different things for things like opportunities, e-signatures, quotes, other types of things. Now we're going to go into our documents library because that has a folder structure for each of our clients. So we've organized our clients areas as folders like this. So Rupert's going to put that file name in. And while Rupert's doing that, I mean, something to be aware of, if you know where it needs to go, you can save it into the appropriate SharePoint site. If you're not sure, you're just drafting or you're just working on something, then the OneDrive option was there available, which just makes it available to you. So now that we've saved this document, one key thing has happened. The autosave button on the top right-hand side of the screen has enabled itself. So because we've saved our document in a SharePoint or OneDrive location, Word will now automatically start saving that document when anything changes. So if you've ever had the experience of working on a document for an hour and then Word crashes and you've just had to try and recover all of your work, you're not going to have to worry about that anymore, because just by virtue of saving it to SharePoint, it's going to get saved. The other thing that we can do is if you click on the title of the document at the top there, please, we can actually just directly rename the document. So let's say, for instance, there was a typo, or if I wanted to put some additional words in there, then I could go and do that. Whereas if you're coming from a file share, you'd have to shut Word down and then you'd have to go into Windows Explorer to go and rename the document. So now I can actually just do that natively. So what we're going to do is have a look and see where that document has been saved. So Rupert, would you mind just opening up our SharePoint site a minute? So we're going to go to our clients tab, our clients in that menu option. And we saved it into the Blue Rock Incorporated folder. Now, just before I do that, again, just worth highlight. So from the SharePoint sort of website experience, again, we have these libraries down the left-hand side for different contexts. So we've got perhaps a templates library. We've got something for other types of scenarios that we might be working on. But actually, we're just working in the documents area itself. And then what we're looking at is a concept called document set. So you'll notice that the icon of those folders is a little bit different to a normal folder icon. And the key thing is that each folder can have some additional information tagged to it. So when we look at that Blue Rock Incorporated, we can see it's got a column that says that it's part of the finance sector. And actually, there's the client name. Now, if we click inside this, what we'll see is we've got our document that we just saved. So of course, we didn't have to go and open SharePoint to do that. We just saved it from Word, but that document has been saved in here. But also the other thing that I think is really useful, particularly because it's a document set, is that the columns we assigned to the document set have now been inherited onto the document. So people worry about this concept of when should I use metadata? Is it useful? It's quite an overhead to go and tag everything. Well, actually, you can go and tag up your folders and then drop your documents into them, which will then automatically assign this metadata, which will make it easier to search for at a later date.
And actually, I was speaking to a client yesterday, and they were saying how they need the customer ID against every document. So this would be a perfect use case for that.
Exactly that.
Okay, Ben, is that a good point to summarize this first step?
Yeah, I think so. Yes, absolutely. So let's just go and do a quick summary.
Okay, so I think the first thing you said is define your templates. I know we speak to lots of organizations, and this is the prompt to do that because we're going to put them somewhere centrally, but also we can think about more advanced scenarios where maybe groups of people have different access to different templates based on their roles within the organization. The second thing is to train people to start with a template. Most people start with a blank PowerPoint, for example, or a blank Word doc. but you're making it so easy. It's only one extra click to get that template going. You haven't really got to go and find it. And you're starting in the tool where most people start, which is their Office tool, rather than starting in SharePoint. And then I think then the final point you touched on was saving there. So save early and save in the cloud. And that cloud could be OneDrive if you're not sure where you're going to save it, or maybe it's something just for personal use, which isn't ready to be shared yet. Or if you do know where it needs to go, then put it straight to SharePoint. One of the things we're going to come on to later, Ben, is making sure how those SharePoint libraries appear in Microsoft Word to make it easy. Okay, so that's phase one. We created a document. Next piece is collaboration. And actually, we've grouped together the first stage here is once I finish collaborating, what's the approval process look like?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the key thing here is about this concept of single version of the truth. So historically, people are emailing documents to each other, and we speak to a lot of clients, and although SharePoint has been around for quite a while now, this is still behavior that is happening. So people are emailing documents to each other, they're making their changes, they're sending them back, and then those documents become very inconsistent and they're lying around in people's inboxes. So using SharePoint, we don't need to do that. We can just send a link to this document and everyone works on it together, and there's just that single version of the truth. So Rupert, would you mind just opening up Word again, please, if that's okay?
Sure.
So what we're going to do here is, now that we've started working on this document, we're going to get some input from one of our colleagues. And actually, the way that we can do that, we can share it, but actually I want to show you something else, which is this concept called modern comments. So if you go click on the review tab, we're going to go and add a new comment here. And actually, I can go and @mention my colleague. So let's go and @mention Diego, our colleague. And what we're doing is effectively, we're going to notify Diego that we'd like him to do something, and he'll be able to go and see the question that we've got for him. In fact, we can go and assign that to him, and we'll go and send it. Now, because Diego hasn't got access to this document already, we've been prompted by Microsoft Word to share that to him. So let's just go and share the document to him. And that's gone and granted him access. So Rupert, would you mind jumping over to Diego, please?
Okay.
Okay, so we've jumped over to Diego's profile. We're going to go and have a look at Diego's email. And in fact, as we were watching that, we could see the little notification banner happen there. So we can see that our fictitious colleague Megan has gone and notified Diego of something. So what we're seeing here is quite interesting. We've seen that Megan has assigned a task to Diego. We can see the comment, and actually it's just given us a quick document preview of the section that Diego will be working on. The other thing we can actually do directly within this interface here is that we can actually comment on the document, but from the email straight away. So we can see that Rupert's gone and made his comment, and it's actually just gone and updated that directly within the email pane itself. Now, of course, if we want to go and have a look at that comment, let's just go and do that. We click on the go to comment option. And what this is going to do is take Diego straight into the document. We're going to be using Word Online in this particular case. So it's taken Diego straight into the document, and we can see where that comment has been added, and we can actually see that the reply has been made directly within the body of the document. Now, another point about this, which people aren't always familiar with, is this concept of co-authoring. So actually, Diego could come in and start making some modifications. So let's say we're going to go and do a quick update to that section. So we can see that Rupert's gone and added an additional bullet point there. So Rupert, why don't we jump back to Megan a minute and take a look and see what that's looking like in her version of Word.
And I think what's interesting here is I'm operating in a web browser. Megan is using, as I call it, full fat Word. So we can have that mix and match. And over time, you'll notice that Word in the browser has got much, much closer to Word on the desktop.
Exactly. So we can see a couple of things. So first of all, we can see that the comment has been added in already. We can see that that third bullet point has just been added. And actually, Rupert, would you mind just hovering up near the top of the screen where it says comments? We can see that Diego has got this document open as well. So effectively, we're editing this document at the same time. And this is really useful in that review and collaboration scenario where you don't have to wait for someone to go and lock the document out before doing things. Before we move ahead, Rupert, just to put you on the spot, I'm going to do one more thing, which is, could you click on the share button, please? It's just worth noting, if you click on the share option, there are a couple of options in terms of how you do this. So I used a modern comment to share with Diego. I could do it this way as well. So I could enter Diego's name. And in that scenario, if you click on the little drop down on the right-hand side, I've got a couple of options as to how I want Diego to have access. So it may be like I didn't want Diego to be able to edit the document. I just wanted him to view it and have read access. But one of the really useful things that Microsoft Word gives us is the ability to review. So what that would do is allow Diego to make comments on the document, but not to actually change the body of the document itself. So that's just quite a useful summary. Now, we didn't need to do that because we used the modern comment, which did the same thing, but it's just a couple of different ways of collaborating with our colleagues there. Now, the final thing we're going to do just quickly is, could you go back into the title pane a minute, please, Rupert? We're just going to have a look here at the version history. So again, one of the key advantages of saving our documents in SharePoint is that as we start working on them, we've got a history of what's been happening. So we can see the original document was created at 20 past 12 or 19 minutes past 12. And then we can see that some modification happened. And then, in fact, Diego came in and made a change a little bit later on. Now, one of the real advantages of Word in particular is because we have the track changes capability, we can use that behavior to actually see visually the differences between these documents. So Rupert, if you can click on the original version of that, we're going to say open version. So that's going to load up the original version of that document, but I can actually go and compare it. So then what we see when this goes into compare mode is if I scroll down, I mean, there's quite a lot going on in this screen, but as I scroll down, I can see, similar to the track changes capability, I can see where the amendments actually happened. Now, the real advantage of this is it means that you don't have to go in and apply track changes when you're collaborating with your colleagues. Just by nature of having the document in a single place and people collaborating on it, you're going to get a version history, and then you can use that to actually track back where changes were made and what happened.
I think that's really interesting because obviously track changes requires manual user intervention. Version history happens automatically. So I do find a bit of a tip here that some of this revision stuff is noise. So you might be better off focusing on the compared document pane in the middle.
Yeah,
Okay, Ben.
absolutely. Now, so moving on to the next kind of part of this. So we've collaborated on the document, and the next stage is that we actually want to go and do the review and actually go through the approval process. So we're going to jump back to where our document was. And in fact, Rupert, if you click on the File tab and go to Info, and then you can say Open File Location. So we found ourselves coming back to the location where we were storing our document. And what we're going to do now is we're going to go and issue this for approval. So we're going to use an out-of-the-box capability that comes with SharePoint called Request Sign-Off. It's available under the Automate section here. And if you just click on that Request Sign-Off button, you can see we've got a whole load of additional automations here that we've used for other webinars, but we're just going to focus on this out-of-the-box one for the moment. So what this is going to do is prompt us to choose a user that we're actually going to go and send this to. So we're going to go and send this to Diego for approval. We might put a message in there that gives them a bit of context. Yeah, perfect. So we'll go and run that. Now, the thing about this is while we just wait for that to come through is, so this is a very useful workflow because it's available automatically without any configuration. The downside of it is that it doesn't really have any business rules. So if, for instance, you needed some rule that says you can't approve it yourself or it needs to go to certain people, in that scenario, you need to build your own version of an approval process. Let's just go and take a look at this. Now, it can take a few seconds to come through. Maybe let's just go and have a quick look at Teams because sometimes it will come through in Teams first.
There it was actually. It came through this. There we go.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, okay. We didn't have to wait too long then. So what we've seen here is an approval request, which has come through from Power Automate, which is effectively the automation engine that you have as part of Microsoft 365. We've got a link to the document that we can see here. We've got the context, the message that was passed in, and then we've got our options to approve or reject. So I think what we're going to do, we're going to go and approve this document. So let's just go and expand that. We can enter on our own comments back, and then we can go and submit it. So the thing I really like about this is it actually changes the body of the email as you go. This is called an adaptive card, and effectively it's something that it means when I'm going through my email, I can almost see the things that I've actually done and the things that I need to do. The other thing is that this does, although we're using Outlook on the web, does also work on the Outlook mobile device, and it works on the Outlook desktop as well. So let's just jump back to our Megan demo quickly, and we'll go and have a look at that document status and see what's happened. May just want to refresh your screen because it hasn't quite come through yet. There we go. So we can see, yeah, that's it. We can see the sign-off status has changed to approved. And actually, Rupert, if you just perhaps go and have a look at the version history of this document, we can see, yeah, that's it. We can see that that update has come through here. Okay, so we can see the sign-off status is approved. That almost becomes like your quite lightweight audit trail in that particular case.
Okay, I think that brings us to a sort of nice close on the approval piece. Obviously, that was a really simple one-stage approval. Many clients have multi-stage approvals and might be like a subject matter expert approval or a department head approval, and then maybe a quality approval if you're looking at policies and procedure management. So let's just summarize what we've seen there. And here are the takeaways that, from that. Number one is you've got the ability of app mentions, and that works within your organization. It's also, as you noticed there, I need to type in the first 3 characters of somebody's name, and then it's going to query the directory and bring back a list of people who may match that. So you haven't got to type in the whole email address. Naturally, as you saw in that example, there's a security question. It did grant access to that file because we asked it to. So there is a consideration there. And then point 3, email could still be the answer. What's the meaning behind that?
So I think there are still scenarios when sending emails to others is valid. And typically that may be something where you're sending outside your organization. So that could be because, you have a technical restriction that has been applied by IT that you're not allowed to share outside your organization. Alternatively, it could be useful for issuing formal documentation that they may need to go and file in their own repository. So let's say there's a contract of some sort, you need a copy of it, you're going to email it to them, they need to keep a copy of it for their own records. So yes, I think in the collaboration scenario, sometimes, most of the time, you're going to be sharing a single source of the truth. But if you're sending information outside of your organization, there is still a place for email.
Okay. And then the second part of that demo was around approval process. So we showed the simple one-step approval process that is available out the box. You don't need, advanced technical skills to make that happen. That just is there. If you did want to go down a more custom approach with multi-stage approvals, then yes, that would require configuration, more technical skills. So moving on from approvals, Ben, let's talk about the management of documents once they're maybe approved, and also search is a big piece.
Yeah, so I think we're going to do this with by talking about this concept of a controlled document. So just a quick bit of context. A controlled document is something like a policy or a procedure that has a formal defined lifecycle. So typically we'd need to have an owner assigned to it. It might need to be reviewed every 2 years. It could be something that needs a unique reference number assigned. And this will be particularly relevant if you're an organization that has got an ISO 9001 accreditation, where you have to demonstrate how your documents are managed and controlled that describe what you're doing. So we're going to use that as the basis for this sort of conversation. So Rupert, would you mind just firing up our demo again? We're going to jump over to our policies area here. So within our policies hub, what we're looking at here is effectively a search experience of all of the different policies that we need to have access to. And we can see on the left-hand side that we have these tags for things like department, keywords, etc., that are going to help us narrow down and find our information. So as an end user, I want to be able to search my content, and I want to be able to go and refine and narrow down and filter what it is that I'm looking for. So let's say I want to go and filter by HR policies, for instance. So we're going to apply that. And then I might want to go and further narrow down for things like absence and leave or family leave. Okay. So we're just going to apply that as well. So what we've done is gone and narrowed down our set of search results so we can actually see what it is that we need to see. Now, we're just going to take a quick look at where these documents are published. So if you can hover over the administration navigation, please. We're going to go into our documents area. And what we'll see here is that all of these documents, they've been filed in this repository, or published, I should say, in this repository. They've got things like document numbers assigned, and we can see that we have these tags for the department, the policy. And in fact, if you were to scroll over, we have additional information for things like next review date, when it was issued by, etc. So we've got a combination of our information that will help people find stuff, and then information that help the governance of these documents. So the key point around all of this is, while I'm collaborating and while I'm approving, I'm perhaps less worried about things like metadata. But now I'm publishing because I need to make this information available for others. So at this point, I need to be thinking quite carefully about the metadata that I want to assign, because that's going to help other people actually go and find this stuff and actually go and access what it is that they need.
The other thing I noticed, Ben, is when we clicked into this document library here, the actual text appeared changed to search this library.
That's right. Yeah. So I think that's a very good point, Rupert, which is about this context of search and how search behaves. So obviously our homepage, we had a search screen there, but effectively at the top of every SharePoint site, you have the ability to search for content. And that context of search will change depending on where you are. Perhaps if you jump back to the homepage a minute, maybe open, yeah, that's it. We'll just go back to the intranet. Yeah, that'll do. So again, you see at the top bar, we'll see it just come through in a second. Yeah, in that scenario, I would be searching all content within the site. If I went to the intranet hub homepage itself, I would be searching across all of SharePoint. So when people talk about, search isn't that effective, sometimes the problem is that their search is returning results from everywhere, as opposed to search being scoped to only return information from a specific site or a collection of sites, or a hub site.
Okay, that was useful, Ben. So let me just summarize what we've seen there. So at that endpoint, we talked about where do you start search. Most people have an idea of where the document might be stored in terms of a site and maybe even document library. So I would suggest is you navigate to that area first and then you start your search, because that means you're not going to pull back search results from different parts of SharePoint. The other thing, we talked about the value of metadata, and Ben really talked on sort of the right time to do it is normally when you publish it or when you're filing it. That's the point where you want to add your metadata, probably not in the collaboration stage where things might be quite fluid. And then that final piece that we talked about, publishing. So one of the big goals that we have is single source of the truth and trust in when we find that source of the truth. And there's a couple of things showed there. So although that was a screen from our Policy Express product, it was showing us that by having those documents all in one place in a published area, and actually we did an extra thing there, we had them as PDFs, that people have confidence that the information that they're looking for is the correct version of that information. So then we talked about that. Let's move on to the last segment of this, which is the more advanced document management features, so retention and disposition.
Yeah, absolutely. So, retention is effectively how long I need to keep things for. And then disposition is saying, after what point am I obliged to remove information? So I'm not keeping anything for longer than I actually need to. So what we're going to do, Rupert, would you mind just going and opening up the demo environment again? And we're going to go and jump into the HR area a minute. So if we go to this HR area, we're going to go into our employee records, for example. And let's just go into Alan's subfolder there. So what we have here is we have a whole load of information about this particular individual, and there'll be some form of obligation to keep this. Now, at the moment, we don't have anything applied. And actually, what we're going to look at doing in a minute is creating something called a retention label that will allow us to apply a restriction or a requirement that actually keeps a document for a certain period of time. Now, these aren't actually deployed in this environment at the moment, but what we're going to do is show you how you can actually go through and start defining some labels that you could assign to your document libraries that then ensure that you're keeping information or disposing of it after the appropriate time. Now, we're going to go a little bit technical in terms of this demo. So what we're going to do is just hover over to our administration center for Microsoft 365. And we've actually come into Microsoft Purview, or the compliance center. There's a whole load of information here. There's things around protection and encryption and e-discovery and all of those types of things. But what we're interested in is the data lifecycle management. So Rupert, if you click into labels, please. What we're going to do is go through the process of defining a label for HR documents. We've got a few things in here already, some that we've sort of set up earlier, but we're going to go through and create a brand new one from scratch. So if you go and say, create a new label, we're going to give it a name. And we're going to go and call that HR record. That'll do. That's fine. Now, it is useful to give it a description for users. So you could say what it is that it's trying to do, how long it needs to do it for, et cetera, et cetera. That's fine. We'll just copy that up. So let's just go and press next. So the next thing is, what are we actually trying to do with this label? What does it need to do? So we've got three options. The first one is about keeping items for a period of time. The second option is about doing something after a certain period. So if you had a requirement that says whatever content it is, it needs to be disposed of after 3 years, this is the option that you would choose. And then the third option is just to label things, which isn't necessarily that useful in this case. So we want to retain our documents for 7 years, but then actually we want to dispose of them afterwards. We're going to go with the first option. So if you just click on next, and then we'll show you what to do next. So that's going to keep it for 7 years. That's the default. If we click on custom, we do have some alternative options. So you can actually do something like define a period to keep it for 6 months, for example, but we'll just go with the default that we had there. And then if you have a look at when this is going to be based on, we've got this based on when items were created, but it could be things like when they were last modified, or when the label was actually applied, or some form of activity such as a product time, lifetime, or an expiration of a contract. We're just going to go with when the items were created for the moment. So if you just click on next. So what happens after that period? So we're going to keep it for 7 years, and then what? Now, we want to delete our documents after 7 years. I mean, perhaps that's a bit of a contrived scenario, but in our case, we're going to delete it for 7 years. This might be a bit more relevant for things like perhaps candidate CVs. You don't want them lying around for too long, so you could just dispose of it after a period of time. So we're going to click delete items automatically. If I didn't want to do anything with it, I just needed to ensure that it was kept for 7 years, but I don't care what happens afterwards, then I would just use the bottom option, which is deactivate retention setting. And then you can see there's some additional things like run a Power Automate flow. So I could even actually kick off a custom process that happens afterwards. Now we're just going to keep the top option though for the moment. So let's just go and set that back to delete automatically.
Yeah, I think that Power Automate flow, Ben, I've heard scenarios where people have documents and they want to move them to an archive area after a period of time when no one's. So if no one's touched this document for 12 months, we're just going to archive it somewhere else. It's not deleted. It's still there, but it's not going to start messing up our search results, for example.
Exactly. So we're going to go and create that label. Let's just go and let that run. And then what we're just going to do, we'll give that a second. It takes a few seconds to run. We'll just click on do nothing for the moment, actually, because I want to go and show you the next step. So we've created a label that defines some behaviors, keep documents of 7 years, and then delete them. The next stage is that we need to publish this label to the locations that should be allowed to use it. And we're going to use a label policy to do that. So if you click on the next tab, please, we're going to go publish labels, click on that button, choose the labels to publish. So we're going to go and click choose, and we're going to go and add our HR policy record that we've just created. And just click next. Not worried about the next screen. We'll just move on. What type? So we want to publish this to a static location, but you could actually create dynamic locations as well. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but it is something that can be quite valuable. So let's just go and move this on.
Yeah, I think that's definitely one for another webinar, Ben.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's useful to be able to choose what locations we're actually going to push this to. They don't need to be relevant for everywhere. So for instance, we're not going to publish this to Exchange or OneDrive or Microsoft 365 groups. We'll just leave that on. Now, it is possible to go and target this to specific SharePoint sites. We're not going to do that for the moment. But if you wanted to do that, it'd just be a case of editing and just applying the URL of the SharePoint site and making that available. We're just going to leave this as it is and just press next. Let's just call this HR policy publish or something along those lines. That'll do. Press next, then submit.
Okay.
So, I mean, just a point that's worth noting is as it's doing this, these labels take a little while to come through. Okay. So sometimes they come through in a day. I think Microsoft are perhaps a little bit cautious when they say it could take up to a week. Normally it should be available within 24 hours. And once that's come through, that label will be available to set as part of the metadata of the document. And that can be done either manually, or you can start looking at automatic rules, which will go and apply that label to documents based on certain characteristics.
So that's interesting, Ben. So if I have a applicants folder where people put the CVs come into my organization, that label can be applied automatically. I'm not relying on a user to say, oh, now the CVs come, I must apply that label.
That's right. So I could go and set that label as a default on that folder or that library, and any documents that go into it will have it automatically applied. Now, there are some different licensing considerations around that, but that's something that we could get into, as a follow-up or as perhaps in the Q&A, and if anyone's got any questions about it.
Okay, perfect. So let's just summarize that. So number one is to put labels in, you do need a conversation with whoever owns the compliance obligations around that. So it might be, an IT person who implements it, but you need to understand the business requirement or the organization's requirements. Once that's done, then you can go about defining and publishing your labels and think about where they can be published. As Ben touched on earlier, we might just want to publish certain HR labels to HR sites. And then adoption, Ben, we've got a few options here. You just take us through these at a very high level.
Yeah. So, I mean, the first point around this is basically how do we actually apply these labels? So the first and most straightforward in a way is that users apply them manually. So they'll go and take the label and they'll apply it individually onto documents. The next approach is that you'll set those labels as defaults, as I said before, as either on a folder or on a particular document library. And then the third approach is where the real power comes in. So you could apply that label based on some form of rules, based on some kind of sensitivity within the document itself. So if there was a phrase that says highly confidential, then you could apply a label based on that. And the other thing that you can do is use artificial intelligence or machine learning to effectively say, if I've got a whole load of examples of what CVs or candidate CVs look like, then I can train a label to say, if it looks like a candidate CV, then I'm going to go and apply this retention policy on it or this disposition policy on it. Now, as I said before, the licensing is quite different around what you can do manually and what you can do automatic. If you want to be able to do this automatically, you will need Microsoft 365 E5 compliant in order to do that extra capability.
Okay. I think, that last piece is quite technical, but I think what we see when we get involved in document management projects is that often is the phase 2 project. Phase 1 is let's get our house in order. Let's give everyone somewhere where they can store their information and make sure they're trained on how to do that. Then we can start looking at the more advanced features of how we can actually protect our information and also protect ourselves. So, Ben, I'm going to summarize what we've heard today. So what did we see? So we talked about the document lifecycle and we touched on creation and creating where people are used to creating. We're not trying to change behaviors here. So start in Word, PowerPoint, Excel, and all of those you can push templates to. The second piece, we looked at collaboration and specifically bringing somebody into that document using the app mentions. And I think, a lot of people have seen the co-authoring piece before, but they might not have considered how that actually works in terms of bringing individuals into a certain part of a document and getting those emails in their inbox. Then we looked at the review and approval process, and particularly on the approval piece there, that simple one-stage workflow and how it captures, the data approved and some basic information. That could be your stepping stone to something bigger. Then manage and search. Our use case there was around controlled documents and how we might be able to use filters there to actually drill down to the correct document really, really quickly. But also Ben touched on the search scope at the top of the screen, depending where you are in SharePoint will depend what it searches. And then finally, we looked at that compliance piece, which was around retention and disposition. So do I want to protect the document for 7 years? Do I want to delete it after 6 months? Rules like that, and how those rules can be applied either manually or by default or by using, workflow driven off AI. Supporting all of that, information architecture, the structure of how everything hangs together, the security, reflecting how people want to find information, the training of people for consistency to make sure that everyone's going to be working the same way. I think that's one of the big challenges we see, that a lot of people deploy SharePoint, but the training program has not been comprehensive. People might got left out, and then, they're left a bit to find their own way. And then finally, realizing that with SharePoint, once you're live and you're running, this evolution is going to take place. Things are going to change, and you need to reflect that in your environment if you want people to have confidence within your platform. So if this is of interest and you want to have a conversation with us, if you jump onto our website, informationexp.com, you can book a chat with me and we can have an informal chat about what we've seen in this webinar and maybe how that might apply to your scenario. And then I think it's a good point to wrap it up. So Ben, thank you for your time today. Feel free to explore our other webinars, particularly the one around policy management, if it was useful to you. But otherwise, have a good day. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks very much, everyone.